History of English Literature. In this video, we are going to talk about the outline to English literature. The following figure is just to make it easy for you to categorize each era. We are going to start with the Old English, or what we call the Anglo-Saxon. This era started in 460. The dominant genre at that time was poetry such as Beowulf poem. Religion and morality were big things as themes at that time. Then comes another era, which is the medieval period, known sometimes as Dark Ages or Middle Ages. The religious devotion or religious theme continues. Fairy tales. One of most important tales was Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It is an adventure. Also, the oral tradition continues. We have patriotism, monarchy, king. Moreover, we have the chivalric code. These are the stories of heroes, but it is different. In these stories there is no more romance. They include an adventure like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which evolves around chivalric code. The main character or the protagonist is a male hero and he has a serious goal he is following. And there is a courtly love. It is a kind of complex concept. Then, we have the Renaissance. We can divide it into two eras, Elizabethan and Jacobean. The poetry at this era is not religious. Humanism is a significant feature for the Renaissance, which means that the core interest is around human beings, their abilities and their powers. They believe that you can achieve what you want to achieve. They believe you are limitless. So, we have here the idea of shift from the religion and the afterlife to humanism. Humanism started as a secular thing. With Shakespeare, for example, the main theme is love in its various aspects and angles, such as the courtly love, the timeless love, the limited love, the limitless love. What was the dominant genre at that era? The dominant genre, we have drama, and novels started to emerge. Poetry was a big thing during the Renaissance, and the main form was the sonnet. With the sonnet we have two types, the Shakespearean sonnet and Petrarchan sonnet. There is an important group of poets during that time called the metaphysical poets. As an example of poets and dramatists in general during this period, we have John Donne, Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Ben Jonson. It is important to know that during Renaissance, people started to write. It is written. It is not oral. After this era, we have Neoclassical Era. It is known also as the Age of Reason. This was influenced by the progress in science, scientific progress and technological one. How do you think this philosophy of life, of reason and logic, was reflected on literature? They have this sort of slavish imitation of the classical work. They did not support originality or creativity. How do you think the reason and this kind of logical and rational way of thinking affected poetry and literature? How do you think the reason and this kind of logical and rational way of thinking affected poetry and literature? They imitated the classical works. What else? Did they express their personal feelings? No. There are no personal expressions of emotions and feelings. So, you have this specific idea of reason, rationality and logic. We have the scientific method in their way of thinking. So, it was reflected on their literature into two ways: slavish imitation of the classical work, lack of personal expressions of emotions and feelings. Do you think they wrote poetry freely? Their poetry was very crafty. It is not spontaneous, not free. It is skillful. They study the form, the rhyme scheme, and meter. The language is elevated poetic language. The good poem is the poem that is well made. They followed the rules. Anything about the Enlightenment? What about the society? Did they support the individual and humanism? Not really. To some extent, they were valuing objectivity. Objectivity is opposed of subjectivity. Subjectivity is the self, the individual, the personal experience. Objectivity is the social form. It is well for the group, the collective, the universal. They supported order, social organization and harmony. Harmony is a very big thing during that time. You should not try to make yourself, you should be in balance and harmony with a group. So, they supported social organization, hierarchy, the aristocratic, noble, the poor. This was affected their literature because it supported the purity of genre. So, everything should follow order, law, organization and should be in harmony and balanced. This was reflected in poetry because they supported the purity of genre. What does the purity of genre mean? No changes in the form, and when you write poetry, you write poetry, and when you write prose, you write prose. They are two separate genres. You do not write things like prose poem, free verse. The poetry should be highly elevated poetic language and prose should be different genre. So, the purity of genre is the face that you do not mix to try another type of literature. Summary of Neoclassical Era, logical way of thinking. They did not support creativity or originality. Slavish imitation of the classical work. Lack of personal expressions of emotions and feelings. Poetry was crafty. Poetic language was highly sophisticated, elevated language. They were valuing objectivity, universal experience. The individual is less important than the society. Your importance as a person comes from your belonging to a group. They supported order, highly balanced organization, hierarchy, etc. Then we have Romanticism. It came at the end of the 18th century, at the beginning of the 19th century. The main big idea is that the Romantic poets revolted against the ideas and the values of the Enlightenment. What are the ideas we are talking about? Romanticism originated in Europe, in Germany, England and in France. It was powerful in France and then it spread around the world. There is an American version of the Romanticism which we call the Transcendentalism. So, with Romanticism, first, we have the use of imagination. Imagination is a tool through which you create or construct totally new world. It is imaginative. Imaginative is sort of different from fiction. So, they use imagination, intuition, feelings, emotions. What about nature? It is a force that inspired them. They celebrate, admire it, appreciate and exalt it as opposed to city life, the modern life, the scientific technological way of living. They had a bigger idea with city. They resented city, they dislike city. Cities and technology are a sort of corruption. The city life is corrupting your morality and your soul because they believed in the individual and that you are good in essence, in nature. If you know something about the Christian belief, they believe that people are sinful in nature. The Romantics said we are good in nature. We may be tempted to do sin, but we are good in nature. We are naturally innocent, pure. So, they supported individuality and they hated cities. City busy life corrupts you and you should leave it, you should try to avoid it. You should resort to nature as a source of inspiration and as a good place, as an ideal thing. Even the insects and the bad things, they viewed them as perfect. Nature is divine. Everything that exists in nature is good according to the Romantics. We said that they revolted against this rational scientific method and they emphasize the expression of personal feelings and emotions in a spontaneous way. When we talk about nature, there is an important concept for the Romantics which is childhood. The idea of children as pure creature came from Romanticism. Children as pure, innocent, and naive, lack experience. These ideas came from the Romanticism. Do you still believe that children are innocent? To some extent, yes, but they are not really very innocent. This idea of complete, utter, purity and lack of experience came from Romanticism, and children were important figures and characters in their literature, as opposed to kings, queens, aristocrats, nobles, and heroes. I personally think that there is one negative thing about Romanticism, that their literature is escapist, escapism. Escapism is from the word escape. They go to nature and they start writing an ideal kind of romantic literature to some extent and they avoid their everyday problems. They escape the real-life harshness. Their poetry is pretty and naively optimistic. They avoid their everyday problems. They turned blind eye when they are trying to write good and ideal literature. When we talk about literature, we are talking about simple direct language as opposed to highly elevated language. These characteristics may have exceptions. Not every single Romantic poem is having simple language. Generally speaking, the language was simple and the themes were simple and direct. So, these are the core concepts: imagination, nature and individuality. What about the function of poetry? We said that in the Middle Ages and in the Old English, literature was moral. It was supposed to educate people. Whenever we say that literature educates and teaches you, we are talking specifically about moral function. Literature do not teach science and mathematics. Here we are talking about moral function. During the Enlightenment, the main function of poetry was to educate people. Poetry was didactic. During the Enlightenment, the good poetry or the good literature is when you write to educate people. In Romanticism, some poets believe in the deductive function, but there was a new one, which is art for art's sake. Poetry is for pleasure and entertainment. Poetry is spontaneous and for entertainment. It is just to express your personal feelings and emotions. They wanted to have more freedom over the forms and creativity in their literature. With the slavish imitation of the classical works, the Romantics also believe in going back to classical works, but not slavishly imitate. They have this sort of quest and they try to find new sources of inspiration. Where do you think they find inspiration? Exotic places, the Orient and primitive societies. Nature was a big thing. Then we have exotic places, strange and mysterious places, like the Far East. The Orient is specifically the Middle East. So, they started to situate their poetry in exotic and oriental places, as a sort of mysterious elements. They like the Orient and the exotic because they believe that these societies are out of the reach of civilization and technology. They hated the civilization and the scientific and technological fast progress, and they wanted to go places that are exotic, strange and primitive. This is how their literature is different from the literature before. Now we are going to summarize Romanticism. As I said, poetry was dominant genre during that time. They wrote sonnets and they wrote balanced lyrical poetry at that time and other forms. Their poetry was centered around nature and they used their imagination as opposed to the logical, the scientific, the rational way of thinking. They prefer to express their personal feelings and emotions. And they supported individuality. When we say individuality, we support the personal experience. When you have a specific experience, your experience, as individual, is important and is celebrated and it should be shared with. And we said that the childhood is a major concept at that time because they believe that they are the ultimate example of innocence, purity, and lack of experience. They also have this influence by the exotic, the Orient and primitive societies. They thought that these societies are ideal and perfect for their new definition of literature. It is also important to know that the Romantics did not give themselves this name. It is a term given by historians. They were new. They were aware of the new spirit of the age. They knew that they are doing something new poetry. They did not call themselves the Romantics. Later, historians gave them the name. Please, do not forget to like, subscribe and share my channel.